The Academic Faculty Committee.
Brigitte Renke, Executive Director.
Richard Ware, Chair of MAC. Lauren Klein, Treasurer.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the purpose of today's town hall is, or the subject, is the budget. And so what I'd like to do is take a few minutes at the beginning of this to just review the timeline of events. And then once we've done that, we would open up for questions and answers. And if you could go up to the microphone when you do ask a question. Okay. So first things first, with respect to the budget timeline, I think many of us, let's see, go forward. Actually, Leanne, could you help? So first thing is that obviously with respect to the budget issues, they started in March when the government's budget came down. And as I think many of you are aware, that it was a 7.2% reduction. Okay, so what was it? Okay. Okay, so first thing, of course, was the March budget, 7.2% reduction. After that, there's town hall by the U of A president reassuring us that the collective agreement would be respected, and that all was fairly quiet for quite a while, because I'm sure the university was trying to work through things with the government, trying to understand whether this 7.2% reduction was actually going to take place, take hold, and so on, and what kind of time frame the university would have to deal with this. And so it became clear to Oshawa that the administration wanted to make motions towards solving this financial problem. And their first approach to that was to initiate a voluntary severance program, or VSP. And this would involve voluntary severance of academic staff, and that the response of Oshawa was that this should be appropriately negotiated with the administration, and that as far as the terms of it. And so what happened was actually administration elected not to enter into that and simply went forward with the VSP. Now, one of the reasons why there should be, and from our view, that there should be a negotiation on this as far as the terms, is that the terms that would be offered by the VSP would be less than what one would normally get if you were involuntarily severed, for example, or with respect to the collective agreement. That is Article 32 and 33, which relate to either 32, where you have reorganization, or 33, where you have a financial emergency. So then what happened was that in late July, the next move from administration side is that they sent a letter that requested that the collective agreement, which was all of about 3 weeks old, that the 2-year collective agreement, that they wanted to reopen it. And so in that context, the administration said that as far as academic staff, that they were hoping to get up to $30 million from us to help with the $56 million shortfall. So then, in response to this, we had to respond, of course. And so one of the things is obviously late July, extremely difficult time to be able to call a meeting of council. In fact, we sent our feelers out and realized that we simply could not come up with quorum for council. And so, given that it's the middle of summer, our other option is to have the Oshawa executive review this initiative. And so then what we did was we managed to be able to get a quorum of the executive, and executive reviewed this request. So, executive took a look at it and elected to decline the reopener. And of course the intention here was that, yes, executive deals with business between council meetings, that's usually what it does, and it has the authority to do this. But the other thing too is that this allowed us the opportunity as executive to have a decision that then could be reviewed by a proper meeting of council whenever we could establish a meeting. And so as far as the reasons for declining the reopener request, it was felt that it is the university's responsibility to make cuts wherever possible elsewhere before coming to Oshawa. And so that was one thing. Another thing was that we've been here before. Those who've lived through the Klein era and also through furlough days and so on, that we have made concessions in the past. And what has been felt is that it's not very long before we're asked to make additional concessions. So again, it comes back onto the university administration to create a model going forward which is sustainable and which we're not approached constantly with respect to reopening our agreement or other approaches. So yes, we did. I did manage to call a special council meeting at the end of August. We finally would have enough people coming back from field studies and vacations and so on that we could get quorum. So we had quorum, and I can say that overwhelmingly council agreed with the conclusion that executive drew, and that is to decline the reopener. So after that then, in early September, administration, understanding this, decided that they wanted to bring up some discussion points, which is fair enough under the circumstances, with Oshawa for reducing the budget shortfall and what is referred to as structural deficit. So in other words, you can have many definitions for this, but basically that you're going to have budget shortfalls going forward, and you can attribute that to various things. Administration would like to say that a lot of it has to do with our compensation, but there are potentially other reasons, obviously, that would lead to that. So what were some of the things that they wanted as discussion points? One would be a rollback of our 1.65% across the board increase for 2014-15. Another option would be to reduce administration's contribution, or the percent contribution to benefits, possibly eliminate some specific benefits that we already have. Another one is to, which is another benefit but also deals with our career development, is professional expense and health spending, for example. What in particular to these two things, it would be that they wanted a 2-year hiatus in contributing to these two things. And another option they wanted to put out there was a professional expense elimination, so that they would just give us a certain amount of money that would be taxable instead. And finally, another thing was to reduce the dollar value of merit increments. So a fair number of things for consideration from their perspective. Okay, now remember that there was the VSP offer. And so that offer closed in early September. I think you can see from the Edmonton Journal and also on Colloquy that those numbers are in. There were 121 faculty and academic staff who took the VSP. And of that, you can see the breakdown that about 83 of them were faculty, FSO, and librarians. Another 38 are APOs. So the actual savings for the university, to give you some perspective, the estimate has been it's around $14 million. Okay. So if you look at that 30%, that 30 million, then you're looking at, from VSP, so getting about 40% of that. So mid-September then, Oshawa Executive Council responded to the talking points. And the message was, please respect the agreement. We do have an agreement in place. If there are changes that you want to make, there are Articles 32 and 33 within the agreement that potentially could be exercised. And so that was one thing. And the other thing, too, is if they wanted meaningful discussion, let's say in the form, with the goal of potentially an amendment to the agreement, something like that, that what we're going to need, ASHA has indicated, is that we need access to the financial records of the university, because we need to understand how the university is spending its money so that we can feel confident that we are indeed part of this issue and to what degree. And so, you know, we're not the only ones who've been asking for developing an understanding of the university's finances, because if you remember, even the Alberta government has recently done an audit, independent audit, so they could understand what's, or at least attempt to understand what's going on here. Okay, so late September. Our president asked for a meeting with Oshawa, and that actually happened this last Friday. And so the administration there, instead of going through the long list of things, options, they decided that they wanted to focus on the 1.65. And potentially for future discussion would be some of those other items I listed off. So the reason they want to go after something specific is that they have an October 15th deadline to put their budget together. So that means that that's the 2014-15. And by the end of that, they have to have a balanced circumstance. So one of the things that Oshawa said, or we said at that meeting, was that the VSP, in fact, is our contribution. It's a significant portion of that so-called 30 million they think that they needed from us. And the other thing, too, is you have to understand that when those 121 people leave, that the burden's going to be on the rest of us, the ones who are still here. We are the ones who are going to have to pick up the slack with respect to teaching and research programs and service, and you can name it. But that's a sacrifice we will be making, and we will be making it for probably many years going forward. So the other thing we did was to remind them that council said that any discussion would still require that we be able to have access to the books, so that we could have some understanding of what's going on with respect to how this university operation runs, and then we can understand how we might fit into this context. Now the thing is, that kind of thing might take some time. And the thing is, with their deadline of October 15th, I think that makes it pretty difficult for that to actually happen. But nevertheless, I have to say, our university president was open to the concept of opening the books. She's already sending us some documentation, but obviously we'll have to have independent review of what we get from them and also what we would ask from them. So we're in the process of discussion about those possibilities. So basically that puts us where we are right now. So I think what I'd like to do is to now turn it over to questions and answers. And so you're welcome to start in with some questions. And again, if I don't have a particular answer to something, I would obviously refer to some of our panel members here or executive members. So it's up to you, open to you. Oh, and I'd like to add Robyn Fowler here. She's also on our executive, and she represents contract academic staff, teaching members, cast members.
Hi, hello?
Yeah?
Oh, it is on, okay. My name is Marc Bolan, I'm from Civil and Environmental Engineering. I've always been baffled by this so-called structural deficit. the administration gives the view that this was an act of God that appeared on the horizon miraculously, and they keep pounding away on this, that it's something out of their control that happened to them, and that it became our problem. And so I'm just wondering what the ASUA's strategy on that is. Do we have to wait till we have the books open to us, if they ever are, before we, can counteract that, or what's the plan with regard to that issue?
Sure. One of the things I can tell you that is a constant upward pressure on this so-called structural deficit going forward, at least to this point, is that if you look back over the last 5 years, we've actually increased our complement of academic staff. So we've added over 130 staff in total, academic staff, and you can do your calculation of, with average salaries plus benefits and so on, that's another $17 million itself. The other thing as far as this structural deficit is for every academic staff, just a ballpark estimate is we're adding about 8, for every academic staff person we add about 8 administration people of various sorts. Okay? So if you put those two together, then what's going to happen is you're obviously going to have significant pressure as far as increase from year to year, increasing the amount of money that's going to be required to continue our operations. So one of the things you have to think about is, ASHWA has a responsibility of representing those people who are currently working with us, who belong to ASHWA. So one of the things you could imagine is going forward, shouldn't the administration really be thinking about the rate at which they're increasing hires? Because that helps reduce any upward pressure. So I think that's one thing. We don't know where the administration stands currently with respect to this issue of, I don't know if you want to call it a hiring freeze, but maybe a hiring freeze with exception or something like that, that may help us a bit. So.
Hi, it is on. Okay, great. I'm Amy Kaler from Sociology. I'm very pleased to see that ASUA has told the President our contribution is the VSP, thanks very much. And I'm also pleased that you're pressuring the administration for access to the books. What I'm concerned about is the possibility that a quid pro quo could be perceived by which, if they give us the books, we will open up 1.65, or we'll be willing to talk about all of these things which are sealed in the collective agreement. So I'd like to suggest as a negotiating stand, as you put it up there, the VSP is our contribution to the budget problem. We have a legal collective agreement in place. We're not opening that up. It comes up for discussion again, I believe, in 2015. And we are not, we want the books, but we are not asking for them in exchange for concessions on any of these numbers. So I'm really pushing for a strong adherence to the collective agreement. It's legal, it's binding, they have to abide by it. If they want anything changed, the next round of negotiations is when it ought to happen. I would be concerned about the perception getting out there that we're willing to compromise on the collective agreement. I also commend ASUA for reminding the administration that Articles 32 and 33 exist. If they want to do various odd financial things or move units around, there are procedures to do it. They have to go through the collective agreement. Outside the collective agreement, it's not legal. So I encourage you to keep pushing that stand.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Jennifer J. from History and Classics. My question has to do with what the president first told everybody, that there's got to be vertical cuts. But since then, we just haven't heard much about that. And what we have seen with VSP, these are sort of no planning cuts, or, with the 1.65 rollback, that's like across the board cut. So During the meeting on September 27th, did the executive ask questions to the administration about the vertical cuts? Are they thinking about it, or have the vertical cuts been laid to rest or been killed?
I think the way that it's been happening, just so you know, is that the central administration took the view that they've had prior cuts in central administration last year and the year before, and then what they're doing is taking an additional 3% cut, and so then what they've decided to do is to give the deans the decision power as to how they want to deal with each of these problems. So effectively, it's disseminating the problem to the deans. So as far as how the deans may deal with it, to this point, there's little discussion about vertical cuts. What you see is it seems piecemeal. And you can see, certainly with the VSP, that the composition of our academy is really potentially being distorted by who elects to retire and who doesn't. Because you can see, I mean, one of the things that I just point out that in arts we had a particularly high number of people take VSP. I think that's a concern for us going forward. Also in science as well, so arts and science. So it's a really good question, Jennifer, and we need to think about this going forward, but we don't hear much being said about vertical cuts anymore. That was very early on, but now I think it's clear that it's being disseminated. Okay?
Cressida H, Political Science and Philosophy. One thing I've never understood about U of A, well, there are many things, but is why, as a public university, it's not obliged to make the records, financial records, public. There must be a legal issue here. When I worked at Michigan State, for example, almost everything, almost all of the financial information, down to the salaries of everyone who worked at the university, was completely publicly available. And so I'm just curious about the legal frameworks here, how it can be that we understand so little about the structural deficit, which I think is a very, damning piece of language that we should not really adopt ourselves, and what kind of legal and not just moral or bargaining pressures can be brought to bear on the university to make its financial procedures more transparent, because it seems as if when we look at the scraps of information that we do have, what we see is not actually that faculty are drawing in enormous salaries and that we're all causing this terrible hardship to the university, but rather that there are other parts of the university that are increasing in size and expense in complex ways, right? I don't think this is simple. But when you put that information together, it seems as though there's something else going on, the other explanations you alluded to, and it needs to be explained. And so I'm not sure what the barriers are to that information being provided, apart from the obvious fact that central administration don't want to provide it, because it won't reflect well on them.
Sure. Okay. I might ask that Brigitte, since you're our resident lawyer, she's our executive director again of ASHA, if you want to make any comment with respect to the legal aspects of access.
So the university is obligated to produce some of their records. As Okay, so the university obviously has to produce some of their records, their financial audited records, which they post. They're audited by the government. They produce their data books, et cetera. I don't know the answer to opening all of their books like they do in Michigan, but I can certainly tell you that they're subject to privacy legislation. They would not be legally entitled to publish the salaries of every single employee that works for the university, and if they were to do that, I would be the first one to jump up and say you can't do that, it violates privacy. The ASUA, though, receives individual salaries, and we are bound by confidentiality, so only me and my business manager sees individual salaries in order to assess dues, to determine for our own records. The university is always willing to give us aggregate
information, what the salary mass is, what the, total number of members are, et cetera, what the salaries are, but not individual information, because they're bound by privacy legislation. Respecting the other information, I can't give you an opinion on that, because I don't really know exactly what the university is bound to produce regarding their records. They're willing to give us, enough information, I believe, as long as they know what it is that we want to ask, right? We're in a difficult situation, though, because we're not sure what we want to ask, right? So.
Hi, Chris Brysack, Law. So this is probably a better question for Brigida. With respect to the VSP, you noted, Kevin, that the ASUA had filed a concern with administration about providing that without consultation. Now, were they required to? Is this a legal requirement? Or was this sort of a professional collegiality type of concern? So that's my first question. Are they following the terms of the collective agreement, Post-Secondary Learning Act, and so forth? And I mean, it happened, people have been accepted and so forth, but I think there is still, if it is a legal requirement or a collective bargaining requirement, I think there is still some merit in holding the administration to adhering to that. So my first question is if you could provide any more information on that. My second question or comment is that if then we say post VSP that, well, okay, that's going to be our contribution to the budget problem, assuming that it is part of our collective bargaining or so forth, that it wasn't done improperly, are then we too ignoring our legal obligations and the contracts that are out there by sort of incorporating that and saying, well, okay, we'll give you this, we've implicitly accepted to this policy or this offering that may or may not have been appropriate, and so are then we also disregarding the proper terms of reference. Right. If that all makes sense. Right, sure it does. In fact, we've given a great deal of thought to that, and Brigida has some very specific answers to that, don't you?
So we're in a legal dispute, right? The ASUA takes a position that we're the exclusive bargaining agent on behalf of our members, as stated in the Post-Secondary Learning Act. We negotiate and bargain for our members all terms and conditions of employment. And severance, under the law, is a term of employment. It determines when your end date is and what you get as severance, right? Payment in lieu of ending your term, employment. So we state that university cannot act unilaterally and needs to bargain with us, and we need to send any changes to the collective agreement to our members for ratification. That was our position. Now, the university is perfectly entitled to have a different position. They state, no, it's management rights to offer this because it is not within the collective agreement or it's silent or whatever. And I'm not going to state what their position is. They have the right to state what their legal position is. The point is that we are in a dispute. And we have mechanisms under our collective agreement that state if we have an issue with how management is conducting themselves, we file a grievance. It is a process where we get into a room and we discuss and we try to resolve the grievance. Now, I did file a number of individual grievances on behalf of members, group grievances, so an individual who would have a set of circumstances and it represents a number of other individuals with similar circumstances, and I filed a policy grievance, which is basically saying that the university breached our representational rights to represent our members in negotiating terms and conditions. So those grievances are, under our collective agreements, at the informal stage. It's a notification of grievance which just says, let's get together and let's talk about this and let's work towards a resolution. So in good faith, the university, because of our collegial relationship, and they want to abide by the collective agreement as well, as we do. We're both parties to it, so we're both legally bound to it. We need to resolve that legal dispute. So we are talking. We have come to the table in good faith to look at trying to resolve those grievances. I can't talk about those terms yet. They're without prejudice discussions so that we can have a frank discussion and try to see where we can go forward. All right? And I will report a settlement of those grievances to council, well, first to executive and then to council, so you will eventually learn what the settlements are. Okay? I hope that answers your question.
May I say hello to Chris? Where's he going? Oh. I think we need to remember that both under the current contract, we have one committee at work, and that there's another committee at work, both of whom ASUA Council has made specific requests of, right? So there's certain things in process at the moment, right? So we've got the Renaissance Committee at work. We're waiting for its recommendations to come forward. I'm hoping that when we have those recommendations before us, the membership is going to step forward. I'll be helping, the academic faculty to do that in my role as the chair, to respond, really intensely and creatively to whatever comes before us, right? But I also wanted to remind everybody that, ASUA Council, by putting that motion forward in the spring, was making a very specific request of both the Renaissance Committee and that other committee that we bargained for in 2009-2010, that Joint University Planning and Budget Committee. And we were asking them in different ways to contribute to the activity of understanding how central administration works and what goes on under the various VP portfolios, right? So I think we need to be pushing on that, frankly, right? Then now we will coordinate that with our access to the records and any other independent financial analysis we're able to do, consultants we're able to draw upon, and so on. So there are things in process, would be my point. We are working.
Mm-hmm. Other questions?
After that, I think I'll stand up and say sorry for breaking the chair. My name's Steve Caldwell. I'm from the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry. I'm just a dumb doctor, so I apologize for all the naivete that may come from my comments and my questions. But I'm also newly elected TRAS representative on the council, so I'm trying to learn it all as well. My first comment and or question would be with respect to that bastion of information, the Edmonton Journal. The number quoted in the paper today was distinctly different from that what you put up. It suggested there were only 77 approved voluntary service severance packages. You were somewhere in the 120, so I don't know if you can rationalize or explain that. Other things that were in that same article were quotes by the acting provo that said, this isn't enough and more people will be fired. So my naivete then comes around to the collective agreement that everyone discusses and holds as a holy grail. Will that protect people from being fired? I am not familiar enough with labor laws to know if that's the case. And then the last observation I would put at is perhaps putting the obvious aside, that nobody wants to reduce our currently agreed collective bargaining. Why are we so afraid to do so? I give the example of what we've done in the Faculty of Medicine in a slightly different way. We have a different way of being funded through the university. But basically, in very black and white, it was put to us that unless we compromise, people will leave. And we unanimously elected to compromise and offer significant reductions in our take-home pays in the tens of thousands of dollars per individual in order to preserve positions. Why is that not a consideration in the bigger picture?
Sure. Okay. So first thing, as far as numbers, the numbers I have, I simply pulled off of Colloquy because that's what they put up yesterday. So I don't know. I might trust that a little more than the Journal, but okay. Let's see. So the second thing was about the
Further losses, involuntary losses.
the further involuntary losses. So one of the things is within the collective agreement that the mechanisms by which you could have involuntary losses really rest with Article 32 and 33. So that is for continuing staff that are either faculty, and I think, is it FSOs as well? FSOs? Librarians or not? Yeah, so faculty and FSOs, at least with respect to them in the context of the collective agreement, it's either Article 32 or 33 for involuntary severance. So in the case of 32, that's where you have a reorganization. And there's not much we're seeing in the way of reorganization right now. And as Jennifer brought up about vertical cuts, we're really not seeing that being played out. And the other thing too is the other mechanism is that the financial emergency. And the university is not going down that route. And so you can always ask a question, why is it they aren't going down that route? Well, maybe they do have some money somewhere, for example. But nevertheless, that's the other mechanism. And that's why there are some safeguards within the collective agreement for continuing staff. Okay, the third thing was the...
Why are we so reluctant to consider renegotiating?
Okay, right.
Aside from the obvious.
Right. So the answer to question 2 relates to question 3, but the other thing too is that concessions have been made in the past, like with furlough days, for example. And so one of the things that didn't come out of furlough days for the association is, number one, an acknowledgement or thank you from the administration for doing that. And number two, it was not made clear how many jobs that actually saved. There was an argument from administration, oh, do this and you'll save jobs. But the problem was, do you think we could get an accounting as to how many jobs we actually saved and feel good about it? Once we had done it, that was it. Okay, so you can see how we have a recurring issue of asks. Okay, we give, and then I don't know that we feel satisfied at all from that. And so that goes back to this business about access to the books, that if we can at least understand what the books are and so on, we can have a much better understanding of how we might fit into this and whether we do or don't contribute this time. Okay, I hope that helps. Yeah.
My name is Jeff Pizans from the Department of Psychology. First, I want to thank you all for having this meeting today. And you really have my condolences, you and the executive, because you have to deal with an administration that is difficult to deal with, is slow to coming to a decision point, and really hasn't articulated a good direction for the university to be moving in these times. And I think that complicates everyone's position. So I appreciate the fact that, that you have to deal with that. I think the main point I want to make, though, is that when we consider, I think the ASUA has to be careful about considering what the costs are to its various positions. And clearly, if the agreement is reopened, then there could be costs, and we need to be wary of those. And the list you put up there was quite striking. On the other hand, there are other costs. If something isn't done, and it's hard to know what is the right thing to do now without access to the books. But if something isn't done, the way it looks now, at least in most of the departments with which I'm familiar, we're sort of looking at a situation that is going to be blood on the floor. We're looking at other people losing their jobs. We're looking at, I'm afraid there will be a significant impact on our undergraduate teaching. The students will bear the brunt of that. If we wind up having to cut budget lines that pertain to graduate students and undergraduate teaching, faculty members' careers can suffer under those conditions. And so you have a difficult task. There are all the sort of standard agreement things, but then there's all the day-to-day realities that we face in our departments. And I hope that you're getting all the information you need and get a good sense for the full range of costs for not coming to some kind of agreement that will help meet this $56 million deficit. I'd also like to, maybe clarification, maybe Brigitte, you're the person to do this, about using Article 32 and 33. My understanding, and I've read through them and I've immediately forgot a lot of the details, but my understanding is those are likely to take quite a bit of time to implement. And so in terms of getting to a budget position by, before the end of March, that they're not really, now at this point, this late in the game, it's unlikely that they could be helpful. And maybe you have some details on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, so Article 32 and 33, and I'm just talking about the faculty agreement. The FSOs have one. Librarians only have a financial exigency clause in their collective agreement. APOs have an Article 22, which is a reorganization clause. CAST have a severance clause, as well as SOTS. And TRAS also have a severance clause. But if I just focus on faculty agreement, you have Article 32, which allows for involuntary severance and layoff of tenured professors if there is a reorganization of the academic programs. All right, but it's done with the authority and the procedures in GFC. Okay, and then there's a very complex step-by-step process in that article that basically states it's triggered only by three things. And a budget deficit or a budget crisis is not what triggers Article 32. All right, and the university is very aware of that. It's only triggered if there's a restatement of the university's mission, changes in the nature and delivery of a program, or changes in the demand or need of a program. And under Article 32, program means, that leads to granting of a degree, a diploma, or a certificate, right? And if an academic reorganization may result in the layoff of our staff, tenured staff, then ASUA is involved and Article 32 must be followed. And it's very detailed. It's a long, complicated process which ends up with GFC either agreeing to the reorganization or not. It involves faculty councils, and it involves ASUA. And then at the end of it, it involves the board approving the reorganization, and then it finally involves the minister to approve the deletion or the reorganization. Okay, so it's a very complicated process. Article 33 is triggered by the president. She declares that there's a financial emergency in that the continued existence of the university is in jeopardy because of a deficit or a projection of a continued deficit. And she has not declared that, right? So she's got to follow that article if it pertains to the circumstances right now. And then again, it determines, when ASUA is involved, a commission is set up, et cetera, and it can lead to involuntary layoffs of our tenured professors. So yes, both of those articles are deliberately complicated, right, to protect our tenured professors. So does that answer your question?
And so they cannot be used in the time frame we're talking about, really?
No, it can't be realistically used in this time frame, right? And it can't be used to deal with the budget crisis.
Right.
The 32, the 33, yes.
Right. But you can imagine that if the administration had felt that they wanted to exercise 32 or 33, then they should have really thought about that in March to help them with the time frame. Because what we saw again and again was administration would delay, they'd drop something, and then they'd want a quick turnaround answer on it. And then that was a pattern that kept going forward, and it was constantly stopgap. So very difficult for us to deal with, and certainly for everyone. Yes?
Alan Hudson, Pharmacology. I've heard that 18 VSPs were denied, and we've heard on the news that the acting provost was saying more people had to go. Why did he not sign off on those 18 VSPs, if this is true?
First thing is, personally, I had no idea about the number that were denied, and so by not knowing that, also, we don't know the reason. So this just happened. So once we have some information, obviously, we'd be very curious to follow up on that.
And if I can interrupt, remember that I think the way the VSP program was structured, it was at the first level of approver was the dean. Mm-hmm. It could be that the chair, and then the dean, and then it goes to the provost. So even it could have been that these people were denied at that first level. I don't know. I know there were some that were denied, but I don't know which level and who denied them.
But it is a good question.
Yeah, Marc Bolan again from Civil and Environmental Engineering. I just wanted to make one comment about the reason I personally am so reluctant to make concessions under the present circumstances. And the reason is that I really do not believe it's going to save positions. I think we're being asked to give up salary and benefits while we continue to hire people. So we're being asked to give up something so that the Faculty of Science, the Faculty of Engineering can continue to hire. Because our faculty, our chair says, the effect of the cuts on us will be to, quote, slow our growth. So what they've done so far, they've announced there's no research assistantship funding. It's going from about $500,000 a year to zero next year. So they're going to cut the things they already have in mind, then they're going to ask us to give up something, and then they're going to hire more assistant professors, which I have nothing against hiring new assistant professors, but I really don't want to pay for it myself. Like, I think it's just a nonsensical plan, and I don't believe and I don't trust that it will. I don't think it'll save any support staff positions. I think in our faculty at least, they've already been cutting, and they're going to go regardless. That's the stated mission, okay? So.
Okay, thanks, Marc. Yes.
Just along those same lines, another quote from the journal today underlines the incredulity of the statements, in that despite 77 or 120, however many, voluntary severance packages, it's also quoted that some of these positions will be filled in order to keep programs going, which doesn't make any sense to me at all.
Right.
None of it makes any sense at all. And it does say 77 faculty and 20-something, whatever the others, the numbers do add up to 121. But the thing that concerns me, and I hear what you're saying, the time frame doesn't allow for Article 32, but it's been very, very clear, and it's been stated in multiple kinds of ways, that the objective is the restructuring of the university. So that's my concern. If this is all part of a process to restructure the university, which I do believe it is, and so losses and then rehirings can well be configured as part of that restructuring, and that evidently includes, I said we're going to have some new buildings. I saw a post board up this morning, and you know, there's the new vertical research, whatever, industrial research institute. Is there some way that the restructuring of the university can trigger Article 32? Is there some, because this has been an item of discussion all the way through.
Well, Brigitte, do you have a comment on that? As far as legally, is there a trigger at some point?
I think you're talking about whether management is making, good decisions and, building buildings for our members, right? And whether they're setting the right priorities, and whether the setting of those priorities is somehow getting around the processes in Article 32, because in effect, we are doing academic reorganizations, right? Well, remember that Article 32 is a process that the ASUA negotiated with the employer that says, yes, you can do your academic reorganizations through the processes in GFC, but if it may lead to layoffs of tenured professors, then this process has to be followed, right? So we can't assert ourselves into management's jurisdiction, right? But I would say to you that you have collegial governance, you have an academic voice through GFC where those matters are discussed and determined, correct? So that is another avenue for our staff members to pursue. Not necessarily everything is through ASUA, right? So when you're talking about authorizing the construction of a new building or a new program, whatever, it's in GFC, not in ASUA that decides that, or can stop management from doing it. I think that answers your question. partly.
I mean, I certainly agree with you in the sense that I think we are seeing a vertical restructuring of the institution through these processes. The combination of the VSPs, plus as Marc has suggested, the rehiring of assistant professors in certain sites, right, of certain faculties of the university, is a form of vertical reshaping. I agree with the executive director, right? The General Faculties Council has a role to play here. Now, that's not to say that we don't have a role to play here, too, in relation to that, and I think we need to pursue that.
And also, your faculty councils have a role. Don't forget that, right? You have a voice at that level.
Other questions? Oh, go ahead, Lauren.
Also, all new buildings and modifications, alterations to buildings all go through the GFC's Facility Development Committee, which reports to GFC. And so there's another way in which you can keep tabs on how much capital money is being spent on which particular projects.
Yeah.
I'd just like to say that I wouldn't be in favor of a hiring freeze, although I think it's time to really reduce hiring. The reason I'm against a complete hiring freeze is there are conditions, I think, where it makes entire sense to make sure that we get someone to cover a position. I've heard of one case, and this is anecdotal, but I've heard of one case where the department had 4 people in one area that was very strong. 3 of them were going to apply for VSP. I don't know if they did, but if all 3 took it and all 3 got it, that means there would be one person with several graduate students, all of whom are trying to get through a program, and that might, depending on other conditions, that might make a lot of sense to try to hire to replace that. I've also heard of a situation where an FSO in charge of all the labs in the department was going to take the VSP. Now, if that person got it, you definitely have to replace that person, otherwise all the undergraduate labs collapse. So reducing hiring certainly, and the ASUA might want to monitor what kind of rehiring is going on, but an all across the board hiring freeze I don't think is adaptive.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Yeah, Ian.
Ian McLaren, friend of AASUA. So I've been listening
by the way, I
keenly.
just want to say he's past president of Oshawa, so.
That,
yes.
that having negotiated the 2 years of 1.65% increases and having negotiated the possibility of establishing the Renaissance Committee, it seems a particularly cruel fate that has beset that committee, that given that the aim was to clear compensation matters away for 2 years so that we could look at structural aspects of the university with a view to changing them or negotiating the possibility of changing them in a climate of peace, that the 7th of March budget threw so much of that into a tailspin, for which I'll have trouble forgiving Thomas Lukaszek and Doug Horner. But I do want to point out, because data is a crucial aspect of the proceedings and will be going forward, that it tends to be the case that joint committees, and that's what the Renaissance Committee is, can access data that can't go to either of the principals, or that the principals don't themselves have. And that might have to change. That it might be that the climate is such that that will have to change. But I can tell you, having served as the president, any president of the association realizes by sitting on the Academic Benefits Management Committee, which is also a joint committee, and the structure of which was the one on which the Renaissance Committee was established, has to access all kinds of information that, for reasons of privacy and so on, couldn't possibly go to the general membership, and you wouldn't want it to. But we have to administer a survey on benefits to try and understand what the membership wants to do. And from that, we have to square it or align it with what the costs of various benefits are. And that's how that committee functions. It's another joint committee. Joint committees have to be established, as I understand them, on a basis of trust. And so I think in the case of members of AASUA, what you need to do with the Renaissance Committee is let us complete our work and then take up the proposals and see what you think. Remember that any proposal we make, Carolyn was a little misleading in what she said, any proposal that we make is a proposal that if ratified would then mean that the two principals have to negotiate its terms. It doesn't mean that the terms of the proposal come into effect automatically.
I didn't say that they did.
Okay, that's what the process is going to involve. So next week, our meeting of our public forum, the third of 4 of the Renaissance Committee, will be dealing with data, especially as it bears on professorial salaries, because we're trying to get at this question: is there a problem with professorial salaries, or with generally the salaries of members of the Academic Staff Association? Is that a critical aspect of the structural deficit? We're trying to answer that question. And we started by trying to figure out what data we need to answer that question. It's actually not that simple. And you saw in today's newspaper that AASUA and administration don't even agree on the number of faculty that there are on campus. The newspaper cited the 2011-12 numbers. So there's a long way to go to get the data that's reliable enough to present to you in some form or other at a public forum. But that's what we're endeavoring to do, and that's what AASUA wanted done. So Carolyn's quite right. We've got 2 committees that are both joint committees trying to do some of this work. It's too bad that the government has applied a pressure that no one anticipated. Remember, we got this extension. We figured this was a good idea because the government had never before committed to more than 12 months of funding for the post-secondary sector. It committed to 3 years at 2%. That's what it reneged on. But before it did that, we thought, let's take advantage of the first ever 3-year window and do something with it. So I think AASUA's been all along very progressive, and I think you've seen from what's gone on this summer that it's thinking very carefully about what it's doing next. I think it's representing you well, and that's why I'm a friend of it.
Well, thanks, Ian. I think we have time for probably one more question if there needs to be one. Yeah. Okay, last question.
Mike McGregor, Computing Science. I'll follow on from Ian's conversation, and that was that surprise that we were presented in the spring. It left me aghast that here we were, we thought we had a 3-year deal, and all of a sudden there wasn't a single university president in the province who anticipated this. Has there been any discussion of that? Is there any understanding with the AASUA executive or anybody in the room about how we could have ended up at the pass where the fellow that knew us best, Doug Horner, ended up at Treasury, ostensibly in command of the budget and well knowing of our situation, and that we end up here? Has there been any discussion or any insight into how the relationship between the government and post-secondary education in Alberta is at such a low place?
Right. The only thing I've heard is that we ended up being a 4th priority in the sense that because of the budget circumstances and so on, that we ended up being 4th. Above us was healthcare and a couple of other things. But, supposedly there were champions within the government for those other concerns, and that we fell down the list because the presumption is that we didn't have a good enough champion under the circumstances. So that's what we've heard. So, okay. All right, so I think I want to thank you for coming out today. One of the things I would recommend is please do look at run lines. We put up information as we can and so on up there, run lines at the Oshawa website. That provides you some information as we go and so on. And the other thing is please have contact with your council members. They're both a source of information, but they're also a conduit. so that they provide information from you to council and to me, and you're always welcome to email me or call me or whatever you'd like as well. So, okay, thank you very much.